This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. We are so glad to be back after COVID swept through the family, as per our post.
And I think from that, I've learned two things to emphasize. First off, the rumors that COVID no longer exists are a bit premature. And second, this could be a really mean virus. So, word to the wise, but thank you for the good wishes.
One other quick thing is that more information is coming soon about the updated human behavioral biology lectures, so keep your eyes peeled and be sure to subscribe to get the updates. All right, on that note, we will start with a question from Julian from Montana, who says, what is happening in the brain when you're bored? Is boredom or lack of relentless external stimulation important? Is it detrimental in any way that as a society we no longer seem to be able to tolerate boredom?
Well, this is a wonderfully timed question in that a few episodes back we were talking about this weird phenomenon of capuchin monkeys living in an island off of Panama, young male, adolescent male capuchin monkeys who seem to have gotten caught up in a fad of kidnapping baby newborn howler monkeys, often to the great detriment of the howler monkeys. And the best explanation for what this was about was these adolescent males were bored. Boredom, circumstance where you find an insufficient stimulation to be aversive, to be negative, to be something you want to avoid. And turns out people have been thinking about sort of boredom science for quite some time. There was a paper, 1885, Nature, Francis Galton, who was this polymath who was always required to be referred to as a polymath. And he published a paper in there called something like The Measure of Fidget. Fidget, I think, grammatically at the time would now have been called the measure of fidgeting. And it was his desire to be able to come up with some quantitative means of measuring when people fidget when they were bored as a means of understanding the magnitude of boredom. What was most striking about that was his study subjects that inspired him, which was a bored audience when you were lecturing to them, which is what he was writing about there. And every professor has had experience with that, of seeing fidgeting breaking out in the audience. And in fact, years ago, I was teaching a class in an auditorium that sloped up at a fairly steep angle. And there was this one guy who every single lecture within about 30 seconds fell asleep. And, this is not unheard of, and there would be lots of people, but he happened to be one of those where when he fell asleep, his head tilted back. So with the angle of the auditorium there, I was able to look up his nostrils, and I spent the entire quarter doing that 3 days a week. So one can be very aware of boredom and its consequences in a scientific audience. Modern boredom science came in like 1986 with somebody who first sort of quantified a boredom proneness scale. And you would think that's pretty straightforward, and that you sit people down and say, are you bored right now? And then you ask them 10 more times, and they seem even more bored. Instead, getting at some more subtle points about boredom in this questionnaire, asking, does time seem to pass very slowly for you? And that's a characteristic of boredom. Do you feel as if you are working at your level of capabilities, below, above, below another marker of boredom? Another one is when you're on your own, are you able to entertain yourself? Are you easily able to do that? And boredom being people, time passing slowly, you feel as if your capabilities are not being called upon sufficiently. You have a whole lot of trouble being on your own, entertaining yourself. So, measures of boredom. So, what's come out of that is, of course, the conclusion that boredom is a heterogeneous phenomenon, and there's all sorts of debates among boredom researchers, splitters versus lumpers, as to how many different subtypes of boredom there are. One paper outlines 5 very different versions of boredom, and I couldn't really tell the difference among them. Another big issue in that field is, are you looking at boredom as a state, or a trait? A state, I am bored right now, or as encompassed in the name of that first boredom proneness inventory, is it a trait? Are you prone towards boredom? So these are some of the things that people have tapped into. How do you study it? All sorts of experimental approaches where you make people do repetitive, very simple math until they're bored out of their minds, or where they have to do a whole series of screwing this widget into that one, or proofreading address labels to make sure there were no typos. Or this one scientist in the field, Colleen Merrifield at University of Waterloo, pioneered this video where you sit there and you watch people once every few minutes or so putting up an item of clothing on a clothesline. And then a few minutes go by and maybe they put up another one, or maybe they take this one and put it up on another one. All sorts of ways in which people have tapped into boredom, trying to understand what's going on underneath the surface. So, what are the findings from the field? The single most consistent finding makes total sense, which is while it may be aversive to watch something boring, it is far more aversive to do something boring. Watching, it makes it much easier to just disengage from the whole thing. Being trapped in repetitive, boring behaviors is what really gets to people. After that, turns out there's a number of myths about boredom that come out of the literature or get disproved by the literature. The first one is this picture that boredom is about apathy. And that is not the case at all. And it is much, much better understood as a state of restlessness, fidgeting. Some of the best evidence for that is physiology. When people are bored, they are not on the edge of slipping into a coma. They have mild stress responses. Their heart rates are a little bit elevated. Their breathing rates are a little bit elevated. Boredom is not about being apathetic. Boredom is being restlessly raging against the fact that there's not enough stimulation, and the body reflects this. Another myth about it is that boredom is always provoked by understimulation. And what you see instead is tapping into a concept we've had a number of times, that of the inverse U. There's an optimal level of something or other, and too little could be bad news, and too much can be bad news, sometimes in different ways, sometimes in the same ways. And this picture that boredom is always understimulation, you can have a certain type of boredom, one very associated with aversiveness, when in fact the problem is overstimulation. And again, you see this physiology, elevated heart rate, mild stress responses. And what they have in common, seemingly, too little stimulation, too much stimulation, is what, theoretically is really at the core of boredom, which is lack of control, which is one of the building blocks of what makes psychological stress stressful. Okay, the field has also looked at the state versus trait, people who are more prone towards boredom as a trait. And they wind up looking like exactly what you would expect. They tend to people who are being more prone towards sensation seeking, novelty seeking. These are people whose time perception is in the direction of time is always passing slowly, resting heart rate tends to be elevated. This is the picture of these people, even when they are not bored. That is their sort of basal state of being prone towards boredom. Okay, so what's going on when you throw somebody in a brain scanner and bore them, or you stick a whole bunch of electrodes on their heads? What's coming out of that? And this involves a part of the brain discussed many episodes ago, this network of brain regions that's called the default mode network. And it's a bunch of different outposts in the brain, and what they collectively are doing is, I think the best description I've seen of it is, this is the network that maintains the internal narrative in your brain, and it's activated when you're mind wandering, daydreaming. It's activated when you are going over autobiographical information about yourself. It's this whole network that includes parts of the prefrontal cortex, very conscious cognitive state. And what boredom seems to involve is a disconnection of the more prefrontal cortical parts of this default mode network from the rest of the network. is just disconnecting from your conscious frontal cortex. And people who score high on the boredom proneness scales are people who most readily disconnect the default mode network from the prefrontal cortex. What you also see in some of these studies is activation of a part of the brain, the insula, which we've heard about before. Insula and aversive state. This is the marker of the people who are just climbing the walls with boredom. Okay, this is great. This teaches us a ton, except we get one of these problems that often comes up with imaging studies like this. Are you seeing what's going on in the brain when you were bored, or what's going on in the brain when you were trying to contain the boredom? Are you seeing the response to it? Are you seeing the core to it? This could be really hard to get at. Okay, so we now get at the whole issue of, are we living in a time where we have less tolerance for boredom? And is boredom always aversive? And there was a wonderful paper in Science 2014 where subjects sat in a wildly, impossibly silent room and had to sit there for 15 minutes. And it turned out a significant subset of these individuals, they had a choice between sitting there silently with their thoughts for 15 minutes or choosing to get an electric shock. And a subset of individuals would prefer to get the shock rather than being left there alone with their thoughts. And every paper prompted by that initial study, they always seem to have some quote from, oh, I can't remember the poet, but seems like it should be William Blake, about how the mind could make its own heaven or hell. What I thought was particularly interesting is men are the ones who are more likely to be willing to be shocked, to want to be shocked, just to break up the boredom of having to sit there and reflect on who they are or whatever was going on in their heads. So the final myth to dispel is that boredom is always bad news. It could be other than that in a very subtle way. And this was a point made by a colleague of mine who's a child psychiatrist, who once said, when you have a kid who says they are bored all the time, the boredom is often a blanket for something much more disruptive going on underneath the surface. Boredom as a protective response there. But much more importantly, boredom is always bad for you. Boredom can be great for you since it's the engine for invention. It's the engine for creativity. And that is something that's often underemphasized in the field. And we get some insight into that, even going back to those capuchin monkeys. Oh, those bored adolescents. Why were they bored? It's a great ecosystem. They were living off the fat of the land very easily. And, with their boredom, they were off kidnapping baby howler monkeys. Interestingly, also with their boredom, they were inventing novel forms of tool use not seen in other capuchin monkey populations. So boredom as potentially a driving force for invention. And I saw a great example of this, a paper last year, 2023, in the journal Science Reports. And I don't completely understand what these people were doing, but they were somehow computer modeling fashion avatars where the different avatars in it could pick the color of the clothing, and they can see what colors the other avatars had picked, and you could change the clothing of your avatar with some frequency. And this paper that was called Modeling Fashion as an Emergent Collective Behavior of Bored Individuals, what they showed was the individuals who were most prone towards boredom were the driving forces are inventing new fashions. So that is a model system for understanding Da Vinci or Stravinsky or whatever. So there's a lot of complexity to what boredom is about.
Next, Rock from Slovenia says, I've learned that environment does not influence sexual orientation, but how does that explain lots of homosexual behavior of ancient Spartan warriors?
This bring up a number of themes, some having to do with the structure of military groups, some having to do with, as the main point, that there is a dissociation between sexual desire and sexual behavior. All right. The usual picture, ancient Greece, 3rd or 4th century BCE, that classic stereotype of a lot of homosexual behavior, typically an older man with a younger man or a boy mentor mentee relationship. And what's clear is whatever it meant at the time there, it's quite different from the contemporary issues of one's sexual orientation, but nonetheless, this was a widespread feature of ancient Greece. And not necessarily lots of, but at least there was the phenomenon of various Greek armies having units built around couples, gay men, lovers, who were soldiers in the same unit together. This was the case in Sparta. And they had some examples of that. And again, this was typically an older and a younger soldier mentor mentee relationship. Where it really reached its apogee was in the Greek city of Thebes, which was just becoming a major power to be dealt with around that time. And the Thebistic army had what came to be called the Sacred Band of Thebes, which was a military unit, 300 soldiers, 300 men, 150 pairs of lovers, and they were a force to be reckoned with. They made history in those parts by being the first ones to kick the asses of the Spartans in some battle. And these were rather substantial soldiers, obviously, to deal with. And it speaks to one of the old stereotypes about sexual orientation, the picture of homosexuality as a feminized behavioral phenotype. That one partially went out the window in the 1980s when AIDS swept in and it suddenly became essential for saving vast numbers of lives to do some science to understand people's sexual behavior. And one of the things that came out in the 80s that amazed a whole lot of straight guys was that on the average, gay men were having a hell of a lot more sex than straight men were having. Frequency of sex, number of sexual partners, refractory periods, and such. So that certainly ran counter to the feminized stereotype. Soldiers taking on and defeating the Spartans is yet another trashing with that stereotype. Okay, so you would have these units of lovers, and if they were killed in battle, they would be buried together. And this reminds me of this incredibly poignant story a few years ago. This Ukrainian couple, married couple in their young 30s, Taras and Olga Meister, and they volunteered for the war and they wound up in the front in the same foxhole and were killed together by a Russian shell. And this was the time where the Russian army was made up of professional soldiers and mercenaries and conscripted violent prisoners and North Korean battalion shipped over there. And Taras Meister was a freelance website designer, and Olga Meister taught online courses on gingerbread decoration. So that was showing you who was saving their homeland from an invading army. Okay, so this brings us to this question: why form military units of couples? And Plato, around that time, was already speaking about this. Plato was recommending that military units be made up of pairs of male lovers. And his point was very simple. Your investment in the well being and the survival of the other individual couldn't possibly be higher than if this is the love of your life. And everyone who wrote about it at the time always said the same thing, which was, well, if it's two lovers like that, you're so unlikely to desert them in battle because you wouldn't leave them behind. And that seemed very logical, which it always struck me as far more logical would be for both of them to say, why don't we just both get the hell out of here together? Nonetheless, what we see is a variant on the military strategy of creating bands of brothers. Every military time immemorial takes a bunch of unrelated strangers, and part of military training is to develop rituals, militaristic things that would go on to make you feel more related to these individuals than you actually were, to create a band of brothers. Militaries where people use sibling terms for each other. Militaries, Maasai, for example, in their warrior grades, they never eat meals alone. They only share meals with each other. Once they retire from warriorhood and get married, their spouse refers to their ex-warrior class soldier buddies as in-laws, band of brother sense. And this was elevating the sense of pseudo kinship to a level of you're in a foxhole and you have to do something brave to save the life of the person next to you. And this is a mighty big incentive for people to be very invested in a successful outcome of battle. Now, there were all sorts of variants on this that went on depending on which Greek army. Did you recruit couples that had already formed? Did you encourage their formation after they were assigned to this unit? What was clear was this sacred band of Thebes was a very prestigious, elite military unit to get into, raising the possibility that getting into one of these relationships is something you did for career advancement, even if that was not your basic proclivity. Also, raising the possibility that in a life threatening circumstance, taking comfort, any port in a storm kind of thing. There were debates at the time whether it was better to get two men who were already in a relationship or to form it afterward, whether it was more important to have a couple held together by love or one by lust. And there was actually all sorts of debates at the time about that. The most important point is career advancement. By getting into this elite unit, there's a possibility that somewhere back when at that time, there was some straight guy who had to be closeted and hide his heterosexuality in order to be a successful member of the sacred band of Thebes. Once again, the dissociation between sexual desire and sexual behavior. And as we know, the more common picture for centuries and centuries have been gay individuals having to dissociate their sexual desires from their sexual behavior, not because of career advancement, but because being who you actually were could cost you your job or your freedom or your life. So this is a rather unique exception to this historical pattern of dissociating desire from behavior.
To wrap up, Mariana from Brazil says, there seems to be a rule among my botanist friends to love and enshrine Carl Linnaeus. Can you talk a bit about his contributions to science?
This question made me so happy because even though I'm not a botanist, I adore Carl Linnaeus, 18th century Swedish scientist. Carl Linnaeus, father of taxonomy, famed for that. He was a physician botanist, which I guess was a more common combination back when than it is now. I guess back when you could go to a physician botanist and not only get a cure for your rash, but find out what species of poison ivy you had sat down in. And the rarity of that today compared to physicians with MBAs and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, father of taxonomy, he had a fairly typical childhood in that apparently anywhere he went, he lugged around the same massive textbook of herbology, which he was inseparable from as a child. Anytime he came home and he was upset about something, the kids were making fun of him at school, say probably because of that textbook of herbology, just like Neville Longbottom. And his parents would soothe him by giving him a flower. Okay, so he was into this plant stuff very early on in life, and he went off to university to study botany. Interestingly, reading about him during that period, turns out to have been a fairly pretentious guy, Carl Linnaeus. And I don't know what was going on at the time, if you were like a freshman on the make and try to seem cool or whatever. But as soon as he got to college, he changed his first name to Carolus, to the Latin version of it, seemingly thinking that would make him seem sort of cool and irresistible. Also, during college, he went off on a plant collecting expedition to northern Scandinavia, which was the hinterlands at the time. People by the Sami people, reindeer herders, indigenous population there that predated people who we think of as contemporary Scandinavians. And of course, the usual sort of horrors. Their language was being suppressed, their religion was being suppressed, the usual, in this case, Scandinavian colonialism. The first time I ever heard of anybody in Sweden being mean, but they were being awful to the Sami people. He went up there for 6 months on a plant collecting expedition and he came back having gone native, and he just dressed like a Sami reindeer herder all the time. And he actually commissioned a number of paintings of himself where he's in full Sami dress holding a Sami drum, what I think these days would be called pretty cringeworthy cultural appropriation. Okay, so he grew into adulthood and became the father of taxonomy. Taxonomy, giving a scientific name to every species on Earth out there. Unimaginably boring. You would think this was mostly taken care of already, according to the Old Testament. This is what Adam's job was, which was to name every animal species. According to Mark Twain and the Diary of Adam and Eve, it was Eve who actually did most of the naming, but there were still all these beetle species and plant species that needed names, and this is what Linnaeus went about doing, giving a scientific name to every species on Earth and showing the residues of his Latin pretentiousness. He gave out Latin names. Every species got two names there. So you had things like Canis lupus, which is the Latin name for dogs, or my personal favorite, Papio anubis, the Latin name for olive baboons, or Tyrannosaurus rex. And all of this suggests that this was the most boring drudge of a human who ever lived. All he did was give out names. One of the ironic things about him was this man who gave out a name for everything on Earth in his later years had some sort of non-specific neurological disease, and his final years could not even utter his own name. But nonetheless, we have this picture of the most boring human who ever walked the Earth. No. Actually, he was immensely creative because while he was handing out these Latin names, pairs of them, to every species out there, he was doing it in a systematic way, noting something interesting, which was that, for example, a lion has more in common with a tiger than it has with a gopher. Some relatedness was greater here than between them, and noting that a lion had more in common with a gopher than it had with a snail, vertebrates versus invertebrates, and noting that a lion had more in common with a snail than it had with a tiger lily, animals versus plants. He was the one who began to see hierarchies of relatedness. And this was brilliant, and this was creative, and this was the person who formalized a whole business about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And the way I'm remembering that is the mnemonic I learned back when was King Philip came over for green stamps. Green stamps, when I was a kid, supermarkets would give out green stamps when you spent X amount of money, and then you could collect your green stamps and redeem them for prizes. So King Philip came over for green stamps, and out of that creativity on Linnaeus's part came obviously the stepping stone, setting up the foundations for Darwin, seeing this tree of relatedness, this tree of branching points when animals and plants branched off, and when vertebrates and invertebrates and apes and monkeys. And this was the man who made Darwin possible. So this was a huge intellectual achievement. Then, to top it off, he did something stupendously brave, because at some moment he had to throw out centuries and centuries of theological exceptionalism, theological dogma. At some juncture, he could have hesitated, he could have flinched, and what he did instead was hand out two Latin names for Homo sapiens, just another kind of ape, another type of primate, another type of mammal, another type of vertebrate. He's the person who, with his fancy, pretentious Latin naming, said, we're no different from any other species. So gigantic titan in terms of his role in science, intellectual role, and the bravery with which he threw out human exceptionalism there. Just another species with two Latin names. Interestingly, Linnaeus had a follower, an acolyte, a guy named Peter Artedi, who not quite as expansive as Linnaeus. What he wanted to merely do was given out two Latin names for every fish species on Earth, and he went about trying to do this, and he was on some dangerous expedition from Sweden to Amsterdam to try to catalog all the species of fish in the canals of Amsterdam, where somehow he fell in and drowned. And like oh so many taxonomists, he was a pauper. He died completely without any resources because all he spent his time was trying to come up with names for fish. Interestingly, a poem was written about him by a wag at the time as follows: "Here lies poor Artedi in foreign lands pixt." In foreign lands, remember, this was a Swede who was off in the savage, pestilence filled Congo that was Holland at the time. In foreign lands, Pyx, I had to look this up, Pyx, P-Y-X, an old religious term for like a religious chalice. In other words, the box that they had to send Peter Artedi back to Sweden in, and very nicely, given his pauper status, Linnaeus stepped in there and paid for his Pyx and his funeral. But the poem, "Here lies poor Artedi in foreign land Pyxt, not a man nor a fish, but something betwixt. Not a man, for his life among fishes he passed. Not a fish, for he perished by water at last." And thus we end episode 1 of Poems About Taxonomists, and we hope you will tune in for the next episode.
And that's episode 75, or 1. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.